Hi, LA Progressive family. Today we're going to be talking to James Farr, who is with the Conversation Live. And James, I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself, but I do want to tell the audience that we're going to be talking about a case that hasn't been in the news that much lately, but they probably heard about it toward the tail end of 2017. So James, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell the LA Progressive audience, which they already know you because you write for the LA Progressive. Thank you very much. Tell them about what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sharon, you and Dick, for the platform and the opportunity. As you've just told our readers, I should say, that I've been writing with the Progressive for a little bit of time now. Also, am an award-winning journalist and producer with the Conversation Live. I write about race and politics over here at the Progressive, as well as traveling while Black at Culture Honey. And I've been regularly contributing to the on KBLA with Dominque Diprima on her show First Things First. And so that's kind of how we get in today's conversation.
That's right. So yesterday or earlier this week, you were on the show with Dominque. And by the way, KBLA, boy, Dominque really does a great job. I was telling you earlier, I listened to that show and it was just so compelling. Your ability to just deliver the facts in a way that is easily digestible. It's a difficult topic to hear. And so tell us a little bit about Chistopher Ballew.
Absolutely. At the time, back in 2017, Chistopher Ballew was 21 years old. He was driving southbound down Fair Oaks Boulevard in Pasadena, excuse me, Altadena, heading towards Pasadena, when two Pasadena police officers, a part of the special enforcement unit, basically you would know them as a gang enforcement unit or gang unit. Um, they were out patrolling the area, kind of, in the air quote of out of their jurisdiction, but certainly heading north into Altadena when they spotted Chris driving in his white Mercedes. Chris says he didn't notice them. He wasn't paying much attention to them. They immediately flashed a torch on him, a light on him, made a U-turn, and expeditiously caught up with him. By this time, Chris had already exited his vehicle. He was in the process of walking into the convenience store at the mobile gas station when Officer Esparza immediately grabbed Chistopher, kind of put him in a restraint hold, kind of pulling his hand behind his back and escorted him. And I'm saying that very generously, right? Escorting him back over to his car where they're struggling and trying to figure out how to cuff him. Instinctively, intuitively, Chris is asking, well, what did I do? What's the problem? They're saying, you're driving the car. And like, I'm not driving the car. I'm already out of the car. There's a little bit of an exchange in terms of words, but certainly nothing that would have been, alarming or should have been alarming to the officers, but for them putting their hands on him, which I think anyone would have kind of, instinctively resisted. That's tussle, if you will, or them attempting to handcuff him, lasted just under about a minute or so, and one of Chris's hands broke free from the handcuff. One of the officers audibles, Esparza is in fact audible that he has the cuff and his hands are free. At that point, Chris kind of stands up. Esparza pulls out his baton and proceeds to start striking Chris with the baton. They're tussling. He struck him again. They're tussling. He struck him again. I mean, and when you hear the audio of this encounter, it's very disturbing because you can, at each blow, you can hear Chris scream out. You could hear the pain. It's so much so that at one point, as Esparza rose his baton up again to strike Chris, Chris literally caught the baton in mid swing. And Esparza releases the baton, kind of steps backwards, pulls his service weapon, but for his partner Lujan, and it happened so quickly. I mean, you're talking about a split second decision. But what we see on the video later on is that Esparza had already made a decision that he was likely going to shoot Chris, and we make that decision, we make that assessment based on gun safety, gun training, that you only put your finger on the trigger when you have decided to pull it. But
Okay. So I just want to interrupt you just right here because you've mentioned the word video. And so far, we had not talked about a video. So there is a video of this. And that's why you are so able, so competently to restate everything that happened because you've watched this on video. You weren't physically there.
I was not physically there. A video, this happened on the 9th of November. Let me kind of fast forward a little bit, kind of take folks through, and then I'll bring them back to the video because that's a very important point. But as I said, Chris grabbed the baton. Esparza pulled his service weapon. I believe that he was getting ready to discharge the weapon. His partner, Officer Lujan, just for a fraction of a second, kind of leaned in as he was raising up Chris's head, getting ready to slam it into the concrete. That interference gave Esparza some reasonable reason to pause. He holstered his weapon, picked up the baton, and commenced to beating Chris some more. Chris was arrested that night on a PC 148, resisting and obstruction. He was received a broken leg. They struck Chris so hard with the baton that the baton bent as a result of hitting him. He was booked into LA County Jail, held on a $50,000 bond. He would eventually bond out, right? But at this point, he's potentially facing felony charges. Not until a month later, and this is where the video comes into play. At that time in 2017, Pasadena was experimenting or in a pilot program of body worn cameras. So policies were still developing. Not all officers had them, but neither here nor there, both these officers did have body worn cameras issued to them. Esparza, who is seen as the aggressor with the baton, failed to activate his body worn camera. So fast forward a month. In the month of December, Chris is searching the internet. He's obviously out on bail. He's recovering from a broken leg. He's trying to process the trauma of what happened with him, to him rather. And he came across a bystander video about 43 seconds long. Someone across the street saw that this treatment was improper. They decided to record it. They posted it to the internet. Chris discovered it. Chris released the video through his own social media channels. And then that triggered a cascade of events that prompted then Police Chief Sanchez to release the officer's body worn camera footage. So there's a few different things that happen along the way, but it is important to point out that the entire command staff, when there's a critical use of force, such as a civilian, suspect, person of interest, whatever, like police are involved in a contact and there's a critical use of force involved, it triggers an automatic review. So that means the commanders at that time saw this, the deputy chief at that time saw this, and the chief saw this. None of them, it didn't bother any of them. It was just business as usual. This video comes out on the internet. Then Chief Sanchez decides to release the officer body worn video. At that time in 2017, there was no 45-day requirement to release a critical incident video following such an event. So that was at a time when, you know, police could be involved in something and it would be years before the public would be made aware. But because of the public outcry, because of what we were seeing on this bystander video, we knew that there at least had to be one, possibly two officer videos that could provide a different perspective, right? Chris, following some protests from, like I said, community members, and it's just some things that happened that were so problematic. Esparza was still technically on probation with the department about 3 weeks um, before this event happened. Excuse me, 3 weeks after the event, he would have been fully vested, right? He would have been afforded all of his, peace officer Bill of Rights. Essentially, he would have been afforded due process. Prior to that, and this is important for the audience and the officers in that 1 year review or probationary period, whimsically, the chief could fire someone for not shining their shoes. They're basically at will at that point. But the chief at that time, fully aware of that, right? But they all saw nothing wrong with that. Those same two officers were later servicing the community at the February, we're in 2018 now, Black History Parade. So these same officers who have savagely beaten a community member is now patrolling or providing security or whatever you want to call it, but basically back in that community. And it was really, traumatizing to a lot of the community members. 3 years later, now we are with Chief Perez, who is now tasked to conduct an administrative review of the event. Well, needless to say, these officers were completely exonerated and cleared. The only finding that he was able to make was that Officer Esparza did not activate his body-worn camera. Through that time, through the pandemic, there was some legal wrangling and just things that were happening internally, including the city of Pasadena, both representing itself and the officers. So that presented a conflict of interest. They were waiting for a judge to make a ruling. That was kind of stalled just because of the procedure process, just going through the courts, federal courts. Then the pandemic hit. All right. So everything stalls. You now are in late November of 2022, this past November. And that's when the judge made his ruling that this case is triable, that there is sufficient evidence to support that the traffic stop was racially motivated, that Christopher's 14th and 4th Amendment were violated. Through the lawsuit and the judge's opinion, we learned that I don't specifically have the window, right? But there were, out of 197 traffic stops in this specific service area, 45% of them were African Americans. That's an important number, so we'll come back to that. 55% were Latino or Hispanic, 1% white. The 45% is troubling because when you look at the population, right, of African Americans in the city, roughly at about 8%, somewhere around 8 to 9,000, versus Latinos in the community, it really shows a disparity of how many more times African Americans are stopped, right? And so in this instant, they're a gang unit. They were hunting, they were patrolling, they were conducting pretextual stops. Perhaps they get it right sometimes, but in this instance, Chris was not a gang member. He had never been in trouble. And these shouldn't be qualifiers, right? Like, we should not have to put out a person's, background to qualify whether or not they deserve a constitutional beating, right? Or an unconstitutional beating. So Chris goes on to now speak out. He's asking for the city to take a look at this. There's now a new police chief, Eugene Harris, who has taken the post. Now, we know that these officers cannot be disciplined again for this event. Their process does not expose them to double jeopardy. It's already been adjudicated. Not so sure that the DA can pick it up now that we're looking at, a different lens at it. of it, but the judge ultimately said that Chris's behavior was innocuous and that there was nothing about his behavior that a reasonable officer would find that any use of force or this level of use of force to be necessary and or justified.
Wow. Wow. Well, um, let's talk a little bit about, in addition to you following this case and reporting on this case, your involvement with generating or creating a document, basically a documentary on the whole case and how that's going, and if it's something that can be seen.
Absolutely. Back in 2018, POP, Pasadena Organizing for Progress, Dale Grunemeyer, I'm sure you know Dale. Dale at that time was still living here, and Dale wanted, which at the time I thought was the most vanilla way to tell a story, right? He wanted a very straightforward, almost, I later looked at it like a video deposition, right? Like he really wanted me to sit down and take that. The entire incident lasted about 2 minutes and I want to say 23, 26 seconds. He wanted to expand it out and looked at blow by blow, and we were able to take a look at each policy violation that these officers allegedly broke, right? Well, the chief later ruled that it was just a body worn camera issue. That half-hour video sparked a lot of interest. It was, I dare say, viral. People looked at it around the country, around the world. I later went back in and produced another shorter piece that just really focused on the incident itself, which ended up being a 9-minute piece. And then later, my film partner and myself, Dennis Haywood, produced Thorns on the Rose: Corruption, Black Abuse, Corruption, and Pasadena Police. And we released that film back in the summer of 2020. And as a result of releasing that film to to the community, we were able to raise nearly $10,000, and we decided to award that money to a high school graduate. So this is all happening in 2020. It's months after the George Floyd murder. Um, August, in another case, Anthony McLean was shot in the back, fleeing Pasadena police officers. So we just wanted to take our creative efforts. Everyone was kind of shuttered anyway. And so we had a lot of time on our hands and a lot of ideas. And we decided to produce a feature documentary that I just mentioned. That documentary isn't available for the public to see. You've seen it in a different setting. We're doing that, but the initial interview that I did with Burton, the attorney of record for Ballew, that is still available to be seen, and I'll make sure that you have a link to it for our
Great.
readers.
Great. Yeah, because like you said, I did see it, and one of the things that struck me was seeing Chistopher Ballew, nice, clean-cut young man, driving a nice, clean car, just driving into the gas station, getting out of his car, and I suppose he's going to pay for gas. And out of nowhere, it seems like he's just attacked. It I'm just going from memory because it's been a couple of years now since I saw that. But what did they say anything to him before they jumped on him?
No, I mean, if you consider hey and grabbing, you know what I mean, as saying something to him, but I think in the you don't have to believe me, right? I mean, the judge, if there is belief in the judicial system, right, and the deference that we provide or give to our adjuders, right, he said Chris's behavior was innocuous. I mean, the guy's walking, when you really slow this video down and you really see what's happening in the video and the time from Chris exiting the car to how close he was to the entrance of the service station, right? They didn't light him up as they pulled into I mean, he reasonably, y'all not messing with me. I mean, why, he didn't think that they were coming for him.
For him.
That just wasn't the first thing on his mind. And so to just grab him immediately, that was one thing. Even more disturbing for me was the false and deceptive statements following the event. And, while what you saw in the film and video assets that we put out was edited, right? I mean, we had to shrink things down, right, to fit into a film, tell a story, etc. But I've watched all of the body worn camera video that was available from responding officers as well as Officer Lujan. So I've seen it from the time the event started onto the sergeant in the emergency room, basically taunting Chris or asking Chris, why did he get into a fight with one of his officers? And Chris calmly responded, I don't know how. I mean, his leg is broken. He doesn't have any pain medication. And he says, I didn't get into a fight with one of your officers. Your officers assaulted me. And the Sergeant Bundy, as his name, says, there's video. And Chris says, yeah, that's what I'm waiting to see. Chris didn't know that Esparza didn't cut his camera on. Chris didn't know that it was policy and practice at that time that we probably would have never seen the video. I believe he hoped that there was gas station video. I mean, he hoped there were a lot of things, but when the officers did end up responding, and they're kind of going through their investigation, excuse me, you can see the theater that was taking place, right? You could see them audibling things to kind of cast a certain narrative around what had just taken place, mind you, because there's only two there. So the first thing that the officers are asked is, were you guys chucks up, right? Were you in a fight? Now, you saw the video. There wasn't a fight there was never a fight, first of all. At best, there was an assault, right?
A beat down. There was a beat down.
So that's the way they kind of framed it. They're looking in trash cans for keys, for drugs. I was told they went on the roof. I don't know why. Maybe he threw something. I mean, they went through all of these different charades just to kind of audible what they needed a narrative to be. And it was just a horrible, horrible thing to watch.
Yeah, it certainly was. Well, thank you for bringing us up to speed on this. I'm looking forward to hearing more of the story now that the judge has found that, yes, this is a triable case. Do you know what the next steps are?
The trial date is set for April 25th in the I believe it's Central District, but in Los Angeles Federal Court is when it's set. Will it make it there? I don't know. I know Chris and John Burton are committed to taking it to trial, and I think, well, I know. I mean, their endeavor to get it to trial is to get all of this on the record, and that's one of the things that, as I said with Dominque, what this judge has opined, right, is what we already know. African Americans are stopped, they're hunted, they're targeted, and if the police get it wrong, nothing still happens.
That's right. Now, a few minutes ago, you talked about the percentage, 45% of the stops within that region, well, the African Americans, a region where 8% of the population is African American. But you said that 1% of the stops are white. Do you know what percentage of the population is white? In
Pasadena?
In that area.
And specifically in that area, no, I don't.
But we certainly know it's more than 1%.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
It might even be closer to something like 50 or 60%.
Well, here's a simpler way of looking at it, and this was just some of the shock that I got from neighbors, right, and some white folks I know. The first thing they said is they've never been stopped for not having a front license plate. Like they could not compute the beating that they saw. It was like, well, what did he do? Like, he had to do something. They're not being stopped for having tinted windows. There are a myriad of reasons why they are not being stopped. But what happened, like I said, in this event, these officers were out hunting, right? And when I asked former Chief Sanchez on the Conversation Live in a live interview back in February of 2018, we talked extensively about this. I'm not going to give him a pass. I'm just going to say what he said, right? He said stopping Black men is terrifying. Those are his words. I don't know if that was a Freudian slip, that was from his heart, that was his experience, but that's what he said, right?
Yeah.
And I certainly don't agree with that. And you look at an event that involved Chris. If you met Chris's parents, Sharon, Dick, you want them as your neighbors. Chris's grandfather was a police officer. You know, this family moved from Compton to the enclave in Altadena. His parents aren't that much older than myself. So I generationally, I understand what they were moving away from, right? Only to raise their two children. Chris is at that time 21. He's figuring life out.
He's a child.
He's trying to figure some things out. You know, he's a good kid. You talk with anyone that knew him in the community, he was more than just a talented basketball player. He was just like a good kid, you know? So this is a family you want to live next door to. And then I remember talking with the family, and you know, I have to keep some of this stuff private, right? But who anticipates a $50,000 bond? So when you sit with, you know, the impact of that, the human condition of that, right? And you know, I'm understanding as a parent now, like, you know, you're looking at your kid on something like, what did you do? Remember, no one had any video. They only know that their son has been arrested and has a broken leg. Like, what would reasonably make an officer break your child's leg? Who has $5,000 laying around? Some do, some don't. And if you do, that's probably not how you intended on spending it, right? Like, I mean, it created a real hardship for him and his family. Um, and so when he held this press conference, Chris hasn't spoken to the media since the event. He talked in the press conference about, you know, being stopped again and feeling targeted, and officers asking him, is he the Ballew from the event that happened? But guess what did happen for the officers? Well, while they were on desk duty, right, kind of removed off the street, they records show that they still were earning overtime. They were moved to a special assignment. One is now a detective investigating homicides, and that's Officer Lujan. Officer Esparza is now with the airship as an observer. And so what we typically see in these events, these critical uses of force, right, is that these officers that are involved end up promoted. Yeah. That's what ends up happening. Now, the way it was described to me is that for their safety, they can't be on the streets and they have to do something with them. So while they may not officially get promoted, they're training with detectives and learning the craft, right? And it just continues this kind of thin blue line, this culture of reasons why they can't investigate themselves, why we could expect little to no accountability. And if, you know, as I said on the show, for many in the community, Chris's beating is a contemporary Rodney King. except for he wasn't under the influence. You know, I mean, there are a lot of different, just wrong on so many levels.
Yeah. Well, thanks, James. Thank you for giving us an update. We will keep the LA Progressive community informed. Hopefully you'll write about it, be interviewed again after the April 25th court date, provided that it gets there. Sadly, you know, this is a reality in our lives, and the LA Progressive really tries to keep these kinds of stories center, because I, for one, believe that we will never have a strong, united, progressive community, united in solidarity, until we center these kinds of things. It's why we're just so broken as a community. So thank you, James.
Absolutely. One thing I want to add in there, right? And I missed this. When they were endeavoring to handcuff Chris, an important fact is that Officer Lujan was a lateral transfer from the sheriff's department out of the jail system. Esparza worked in a jail system. The number one activity from a custodial officer is handcuffing people. So when you go back and look at this video and you see the struggle that they're having cuffing him, it really makes you question their intention and the unsuccessful securing of the handcuffs. Now, I don't know this, I haven't read the entire depositions, but back when I was researching this and I talked to officers, and specifically a retired sheriff's deputy, a custodial officer, he said one of the things that they do inside of the county jails and in the prison systems, period, right, to as a form or justification to administer some sort of punishment, discipline, you name it, right? They know that they're videotaping themselves, right? They're audibling what's happening, right? It's tactic strategy to allow an inmate to have one arm free with a bracelet. Why?
Because it gives them the freedom to go ahead and do the beat down.
To do the beating. Because when they write their report, which, you know, it was a year before I finally saw the report, but I was told how it would read. Like, he had his hands free, he has a cuff, he has a weapon. That's their justification post-event. So our readers should also know that officers are allowed to review body-worn camera footage before they finalize their reports or need to amend their report. So there's so many layers of things in here that embolden this type of behavior.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, James. We're going to close for now, but we will be seeing you again, hopefully very soon.
Thank you, Sharon.
And tell, aside from LA Progressive, where else can people find you?
Best place at James Farr Live across the social platforms, Google, everything ends up at one place. So,
right. And that's James Farr, Farr.
You got it.
So long, James.
Thank you.